At noon on March 12, 1928, the most powerful engineer in America stood on top of a dam in the mountains north of Los Angeles, looked down at the water leaking through it, and said 5 words. "It is safe. Go home." 12 hours later, that dam did not exist. 12.4 billion gallons of water, a wall 14 stories tall, came down that canyon in the dark, while everyone below it was asleep. By sunrise, more than 431 people were dead. Entire towns had simply been wiped off the map. It is still the deadliest engineering failure in American history. And the man who said it was safe, the man who built it, filled it, and inspected it with his own eyes on its final day, would stand in front of a jury, take full responsibility, and walk out a free man. This is the story of the St. Francis Dam. The story of how one man's word became worth more than 400 lives, and it begins with the strangest part of all. That man was a genius. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Los Angeles was in the early 1900s. It was a city in a desert that refused to stop growing. Hundreds of thousands of people pouring in every decade into a place with one fatal weakness. There was not enough water. The man who solved that problem was named William Mulholland, and his story is the American dream written in concrete. He was an Irish immigrant who arrived with nothing. He started as a ditch digger, literally cleaning water channels with a shovel. He never went to engineering school. He never went to any school past the age of 15. He taught himself engineering at night, by candlelight out of borrowed books. Andy Rose, ditch digger, foreman, superintendent, and finally, chief engineer of the entire Los Angeles water system. Then he did something almost nobody believed was possible. He designed and built an aqueduct 233 miles long across mountains and desert to carry water from the Owens Valley all the way to Los Angeles. When the water arrived in 1913, thousands of people gathered to watch. Mulholland stood before the crowd, pointed at the cascading water, and said just 5 words. "There it is. Take it." Overnight, he became a legend. Universities gave him honorary degrees. Newspapers called him a genius. People begged him to run for mayor. In Los Angeles, William Mulholland was not just an engineer. He was the closest thing the city had to a god, and that is exactly what made him so dangerous. Because when a man becomes a legend, people stop checking his work. In the 1920s, Los Angeles kept growing, and Mulholland decided the city needed insurance, a giant reserve of water stored close to home in case anything ever cut the aqueduct. He chose a quiet canyon about 40 miles northwest of downtown called San Francisco Canyon. And there, between 1924 and 1926, his bureau built the St. Francis Dam, a curved wall of concrete over 200 feet tall, holding back a lake of more than 12 billion gallons. Here is what you need to understand about that dam. It was designed by one man. It was built by one agency. And it was never not once reviewed by any outside engineer, any independent geologist, anyone at all. Why would it be? It was Mulholland's dam. His word was the review. But the canyon was hiding 2 secrets. On one side, the rock was a crumbling red sandstone, and when that particular stone gets soaked with water, it can soften and fall apart. On the other side, the rock was fractured schist, and buried in that hillside was the scar of an ancient landslide, a whole section of mountain that had already collapsed once, thousands of years ago. Nobody mapped it. Nobody drilled deep enough to find it. The greatest water engineer in America had built a 200-foot concrete wall holding 12 billion gallons on ground that could not hold it. And there was one more thing. During construction, Mulholland changed the plans. He raised the dam 20 feet higher to hold even more water. But the base of the dam was never widened to carry that extra weight. Imagine stacking more and more books on a shelf without ever thickening the bracket. That was the St. Francis Dam. Down in the canyon, directly below that wall, lived a man named Tony Harnischfeger. He was the dam keeper. His job was to watch the dam every single day, every crack, every leak, every drop. He lived in a small cottage in the dam's shadow with his family. Remember his name, because Tony saw it coming. Almost from the moment the reservoir began to fill, the dam began to talk. Cracks appeared. Water seeped through and trickled down the face. Each time, Tony reported it. Each time, Mulholland came out, looked, and said the same thing. Normal. All concrete dams crack. All dams leak. Seal it and move on. By early 1928, one of the leaks had doubled in size. Instead of draining the reservoir to investigate, they simply installed a pipe to carry the leaking water away housekeeping, on a wound that was getting worse. In the first week of March, Mulholland gave the order to fill the reservoir to capacity for the very first time. The water rose to within 3 inches of the top. Behind that concrete wall now sat the full 12.4 billion gallons. Drivers on the canyon road began reporting that the ground near the dam's eastern edge was cracking, that the road itself was sinking. And then came the morning of March 12th. Tony Harnischfeger was doing his rounds when he saw something that made his blood run cold. A new leak at the western edge. But this one was different. This water was brown, muddy, and every dam keeper knows what muddy water means. It means the water is no longer just slipping through cracks in the concrete. It means the water is eating the foundation itself, dissolving the very ground the dam is standing on. Tony called Los Angeles immediately. And Mulholland came. He drove out that same morning with his assistant, and for 2 hours, the two men walked the dam, studied the leak, examined the water. And then William Mulholland, the self-taught genius, the man who had never been wrong, made the final judgment of his career. The leak was not dangerous. The dam was safe. He got in his car and drove back to Los Angeles. Tony Harnischfeger walked back down into the canyon, to his cottage below the dam, to his family. It was the last decision either man would ever make about the St. Francis Dam. That night, a carpenter named Ace Hopewell rode his motorcycle up the canyon road past the dam, heading to his job at the powerhouse upstream. He glanced at the dam. Nothing unusual. He kept riding. About 1.5 miles past it, he heard something behind him, a deep rumbling, like boulders rolling down a hillside. He figured it was a small landslide, common in these canyons. He didn't even stop. What Ace Hopewell had just heard without knowing, it was the St. Francis Dam dying. He was the last person to see it standing and the only living soul to hear it fall. At 2.5 minutes before midnight, the eastern side of the dam, the side anchored in that ancient, invisible landslide, let go. And 12.4 billion gallons of black water stood up in the dark, 140 feet tall, and started walking. The first thing in its path, less than 2 miles downstream, was Powerhouse Two and the 67 men, women, and children asleep beside it. The people at Powerhouse Two never had a chance. It was the community workers and their families living in company houses beside the plant. The wave that hit them was still over 100 feet tall, a black wall moving through a black canyon at midnight. The powerhouse itself was made of reinforced concrete. The flood tore it apart like paper. Of the 67 people living there, 64 died. Among the first to go was Tony Harnischfeger, the dam keeper, the man who had raised the alarm that very morning, and his family in their cottage in the dam's shadow. The man who saw it coming was the first one it came for. Across the region, lights flickered and went dark. Somewhere in an office in Los Angeles, needles on the water system's gauges quietly dropped to zero. The city didn't know it yet, but its insurance policy had just become a weapon, and it was pointed at every sleeping town for 54 miles. The flood exploded out of the canyon and turned west into the Santa Clara River Valley. And this is the part that should haunt you. It was midnight. The towns in that valley, Castaic Junction, Peru, Fillmore, Bardesdale, Santa Paula, were fast asleep. Farm towns. Ranch families. Hundreds of Mexican farm workers and their children living in small homes and camps close to the riverbed because that's where the work was. No sirens. No warning system. Nothing but the sound survivors described it as a freight train, or a hurricane made of mud arriving out of the darkness. The wave swept through a construction camp where dozens of workers were sleeping in tents by the river. It picked up houses whole and carried them away with families still inside. It tore out bridges, roads, orchards, railway lines. People woke up in the water, in the dark, being carried away from everything they knew. Parents grabbed children and climbed for the roof, and then the roof itself began to move. One father loaded his family into their car and stopped for just a moment to warn a neighbor. He turned around in time to watch the car with his wife and children inside disappear into the flood. But in the middle of all that death, there were people who chose to run toward it. In the telephone offices, switchboard operators, young women on the night shift, got word that the dam was gone and the water was coming. They stayed at their posts, ringing house after house after house down the valley, waking families with minutes to spare, while the flood came closer to them with every call. And in Santa Paula, 2 motorcycle policemen got the warning and made a decision. They rode ahead of the flood, into the low neighborhoods closest to the river, sirens screaming, pounding on doors, dragging people out of bed, racing an 80-foot wall of water through the dark, street by street. Nobody knows exactly how many hundreds of people are alive today because of those few insane, heroic minutes. Just before dawn, 5.5 hours after the collapse, the flood finally reached the Pacific Ocean near Ventura 50, 4 miles from where the dam had stood. It dumped everything it had carried into the sea: houses, orchards, animals, and people. In the weeks that followed, bodies washed ashore down the coastline, some of them as far south as the Mexican border. When the sun rose on March 13th, the survivors saw what was left. There was no valley. There was a plain of gray mud, miles wide, studded with wreckage, a chimney standing alone where a house had been, a bed frame in a tree, a piano in an orchard. Rescue crews dug for days. Mothers walked the mudflats calling out names. The official death toll that year was 385. But the bodies never stopped coming. They were found in the mud that summer. They were found years later. Decades later. One victim was found buried deep underground in 1992-60, 4 years after the flood. Today, the count stands at more than 431 dead, and at least 108 of them were children. And even that number is a lie, because the transient farm workers camped along the river, many of them Mexican immigrants, uncounted in life were uncounted in death too. The real number is higher. We will simply never know it. And now the question the whole country was asking: what happens to the man who said it was safe? Days later, William Mulholland walked into a coroner's inquest in Los Angeles. The genius, the legend, the man they wanted for mayor, 72 years old, and witnesses said he seemed to have aged a decade in a week. He did not hide. He did not blame the contractors, or the geology, or the dam keeper. He stood before the jury and said words almost no powerful man in history has ever said. This inquest is very painful for me to attend. The only ones I envy about this whole thing are the ones who are dead. And then when they pressed him on who was responsible, he ended it with one sentence: "Don't blame anyone else, you just fasten it on me." The jury's verdict came down. The disaster was caused by errors in engineering judgment, Mulholland's judgment. The dam had been built on ground that could never hold it, by a man who answered to no one. And then the same jury declared that this was not a crime. No criminal charges, no trial, no prison. 431 dead, and not one single person was ever punished. Mulholland retired 8 months later and spent his final years in seclusion a broken man, by every account, until his death in 1935. The city quietly paid settlements to the families and moved on. But the dead did leave something behind. The outrage over St. Francis forced California to do what should have been done all along. Within a year, the state created a dam safety program. Every major dam would now be reviewed and inspected by the state, not by one unquestioned man. And in that same year, California passed something bigger, a law requiring civil engineers to be registered and licensed. Because the most shocking discovery of the whole disaster was this: the man who built it had no license, no degree, no certification, because none existed. Nothing had required the greatest dam builder in America to prove he knew what he was doing. Today, every licensed engineer who stamps a set of plans on every dam, every bridge, every building you trust your life to is signing a promise that was written in the mud of the Santa Clara Valley. One last thing. When the dam fell, one piece refused to die a single giant slab of the center wall, 200 feet of concrete left standing alone in the empty canyon. The locals gave it a name. They called it the Tombstone. For a year it stood there, a monument to one man's certainty, and people drove from all over California just to stand beneath it and stare. The city finally dynamited it because they could not stand to look at it anymore. He inspected it with his own eyes. He gave it his word. And 12 hours later, 431 people were dead. The most dangerous thing in that canyon was never the water. It was the certainty of a man no one was allowed to question. This is Cindergrave, the stories the past tried to bury and hoped you'd never read. If you want more of them, subscribe, because it was always darker than they taught you.